began with a whisper of change, the faint hiss of boiling water and the rhythmic pulse of pistons that would soon drown out centuries of wind and sail. For thousands of years, the oceans had belonged to the breeze. Great empires rose and fell at the mercy of wind currents, their ships drifting wherever the invisible hand of nature allowed them to go. But at the heart of the 18th century, humanity found a new kind of power, one born not from nature's whims, but from its mastery. The age of steam was dawning. The first steamships were small, almost fragile things by the standards of their day. Yet within their wooden hulls burned a force that would alter the destiny of global civilization. Steam promised freedom from dependence on the weather, a new autonomy that seemed almost magical to those who first witnessed it. Where once captains scanned the horizon for a favorable breeze, they could now command their own winds, generated deep within their vessels' iron hearts. The transformation was not immediate. Sailors were skeptical, shipbuilders cautious, and the world's navies indifferent to these noisy, smoky newcomers. Many dismissed steamships as novelties, little more than toys for eccentric inventors. But history was already turning its gears. Across rivers and coastlines, new vessels were being launched, puffing clouds of white vapor, moving defiantly against the current, proving with every turn and paddle that a new epoch of navigation had begun. To understand the revolution of the steamship is to witness the moment when human ambition finally conquered the most ancient frontier, the sea. These machines were not merely ships, they were symbols of a profound change in human spirit, of an age that believed no force of nature was beyond control. With every voyage, every shriek of steam and turn of the wheel, humanity was learning to command the elements themselves. This story of ingenuity, courage, and transformation unfolds across the great rivers of America, the shipyards of Britain, and the endless blue of the Atlantic. It is a tale of dreamers like Robert Fulton, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and countless unnamed engineers and sailors who stoked the furnaces of progress. Their vision set the world in motion, faster, farther, and freer than ever before. The first steamships were not only mechanical marvels, they were heralds of modernity, bearing within their plumes of coal smoke the future of trade, travel, and war. From riverboats that connected distant American towns to ocean liners that would eventually span continents, steamships carried with them a promise that humanity could no longer be bound by the unpredictable will of the wind. The dawn of steam was not a single invention, but a slow sunrise, one that lit up every harbor, every riverbank, every workshop where men and women dreamed of a world that moved to their design. It was the beginning of a transformation so complete that, within a single century, the sound of sails snapping in the wind would be replaced by the steady beat of engines echoing across every sea on Earth. Before the age of iron and smoke, the sea was ruled by silence and wind. For millennia, mariners trusted in canvas and current, navigating a world that was vast, unpredictable, and often merciless. From the sleek galleys of the ancient Mediterranean to the towering ships of the line that thundered across the oceans of the 18th century, all shared one fragile dependency: the will of the wind. Every voyage was a negotiation with nature. The greatest admirals and explorers, Columbus, Drake, Magellan, were as much servants to the sky as masters of their ships. They waited for the right weather to set sail, read the shifting clouds like sacred texts, and prayed that the winds would not betray them in the open sea. A calm, known as the dreaded doldrums, could trap a vessel for weeks. Storms could tear apart a ship in a single night. Progress depended on the invisible, and the invisible was fickle. Yet the world's oceans were the lifeblood of human civilization. Empires were built upon them. The British, the Spanish, the Dutch, each in turn carved their dominions through maritime power. The tall ships of the 17th and 18th centuries were not merely vessels. They were the engines of empire, the arteries through which flowed trade, discovery, and conquest. But even as they carried spices, gold, and ideas across the globe, their limitations were clear. A voyage from Europe to America could take weeks, sometimes months, depending on the weather. Schedules were impossible to predict. Merchants could only guess when their cargoes would arrive, and navies could not guarantee reinforcements would reach distant colonies in time. The sea was a vast stage, but it obeyed no clock, no order, only the winds. By the late 18th century, change was stirring on land. The Industrial Revolution had begun to transform society with fire and machinery. Coal mines burned day and night. Factories sprouted along rivers, powered by new inventions that harnessed the force of steam. Engineers and scientists had discovered that boiling water could drive pistons, turn wheels, and move great machines with consistent, tireless energy. Steam was no longer just vapor. It was power incarnate. It was only a matter of time before someone looked at the riverboat and thought, why not here? If steam could move a wheel on land, perhaps it could move a paddle on water. If engines could drive mills, perhaps they could drive ships. Yet the idea was daring, even absurd to many. Ships were made of wood, not iron. The seas were too vast, too wild for such contraptions. What engineer could build a machine strong enough to survive the waves? What furnace could burn without suffocating the crew? What if the boiler exploded, as early prototypes often did? Still, visionaries persisted. Across Europe and America, engineers and inventors were captivated by the dream of mechanical navigation. In France, Claude de Jouffroy d'Aban experimented with paddle-driven boats as early as the 1770s. In Scotland, James Watt's improved steam engine inspired a generation of thinkers to imagine ships freed from the tyranny of the wind. In England, William Symington tested his Charlotte Dundas, often considered the first practical steamboat. And across the Atlantic, in a restless new nation called the United States, a man named Robert Fulton was preparing to change history. The 18th century was an age of restless curiosity. The same minds that built spinning machines and iron bridges were turning toward the oceans. The great wooden fleets of the world's navies stood as monuments to tradition, yet within a few decades they would become relics. Steam promised more than efficiency. It promised certainty. A vessel that could move without wind meant independence, reliability, and control. It meant a world where time could be measured, trade could be scheduled, and distance could be conquered with precision. This idea, simple yet radical, marked the beginning of a new era. Where once sailors had read the stars, they would soon read the pressure on a gauge. Where once a ship's master had feared calm seas, he would now fear only the shortage of coal. The sea would no longer be a mystery to be endured. It would become a highway to be mastered. As the 19th century dawned, the world stood on the brink of transformation. Across harbors and rivers, in smoky workshops and echoing shipyards, the first iron lungs of industry were awakening. The old age of sail, with all its romance and peril, would soon give way to something noisier, heavier, and unstoppable, an age driven by the heartbeat of steam. And so the story of the first steamships truly begins. With the clash of two worlds, the graceful poetry of wind and canvas against the relentless rhythm of pistons and flame. The sea was about to change forever. The story of the steamship's birth is not one of sudden invention, but of persistence, a chain of experiments, failures, and flashes of genius stretching across decades. It began with dreamers who dared to imagine that fire and water, so often seen as opposites, could unite to conquer the sea. In the 1770s and 1780s, Europe was alive with the hum of invention. The Industrial Revolution had given rise to the steam engine, perfected by James Watt, whose innovations transformed a crude, inefficient novelty into a reliable source of power. On land, steam was already driving mills, pumping mines, and spinning the machinery of progress. Yet one question remained: could it move a ship? Among the first to try was Claude de Jouffroy d'Abens, a French nobleman fascinated by mechanics. In 1783, he launched a curious vessel on the River Saône, a flat-bottomed boat propelled by paddle wheels driven by a steam engine. It moved slowly but unmistakably under its own power. The people who watched were astonished. The age of mechanical navigation had taken its first breath. But Jouffroy's achievement, though remarkable, was short-lived. Political turmoil in revolutionary France silenced his work, and the idea drifted into obscurity. In Britain, William Symington took up the challenge. His vessel, the Charlotte Dundas, launched in 1803, is often hailed as the first practical steam-powered boat. With a single rear paddle wheel and a robust engine, she demonstrated that steam could not only move a boat, but do so against wind and current. On a test run along the Forth and Clyde Canal, Charlotte Dundas towed two heavy barges for nearly 20 miles. It was a triumph. And yet, again, skepticism prevailed. Canal owners feared the wash from paddle wheels would damage their banks, and investors hesitated. The Charlotte Dundas was retired, her machinery removed, her promise unfulfilled. Then came Robert Fulton, an American artist, inventor, and engineer whose vision would finally turn theory into revolution. Born in Pennsylvania in 1765, Fulton was a restless spirit. He studied art in London, dabbled in canal engineering, and spent years in France experimenting with submarines and steam propulsion. By the early 1800s, he had become convinced that steam power could transform navigation. All he needed was the right engine and the right backer. That backer was Robert R. Livingston, the US ambassador to France and a wealthy businessman with a fascination for technology. Together, they designed a vessel that would become legendary, the North River Steamboat, later known simply as a Clermont. Built on the Hudson River in 1807, the Clermont was 43 meters long, with a wooden hull, two large paddle wheels on her sides, and a single tall smokestack rising amidships. Her engine, built by the English engineer Boulton and Watt, produced a mere 24 horsepower, yet it was enough to make history. When she first set out from New York to Albany, skeptics lined the riverbanks to laugh at the Fulton folly. But as the vessel began to move steadily upriver, leaving a trail of smoke and astonished faces behind her, laughter turned to awe. The Clermont completed the 240-kilometer journey in just 32 hours, a feat previously unthinkable for a river voyage against the current. The age of steam navigation had arrived, The significance of this journey cannot be overstated. It proved that a ship could travel independently of the wind, that time and distance could be measured with precision, and that the river was no longer ruled by the whims of nature. Within a few years, steamboats began appearing across America's waterways, on the Mississippi, the Ohio, and beyond. They carried passengers, goods, and dreams. They became symbols of progress, their tall smokestacks rising like monuments to human ingenuity. Across the Atlantic, Britain was quick to follow. The success of the Clermont inspired a wave of experimentation in Glasgow, London, and Bristol. In 1812, Henry Bell launched the Comet, the first commercially successful steamship in Europe. Small and elegant, she carried passengers between Glasgow and Greenock, proving that regular steam navigation was not only possible, but profitable. Bell's venture was soon joined by others, and the Clyde River became a cradle of steamship innovation. As demand grew, so did ambition. Engineers began to refine the mechanics of steam propulsion. Paddle wheels were improved, engines made lighter and more efficient. Wooden hulls gave way to stronger materials. By the 1820s, iron was being introduced into ship construction, first as reinforcement, then as the primary material. It was a daring transition. Many believed iron ships would sink like stones. Yet pioneers like John Wilkinson and disembarked Kingdom Brunel proved otherwise. The strength of iron allowed for larger vessels, capable of carrying more passengers and cargo, crossing greater distances than ever before. Shipyards echoed with the clang of hammers on metal, the hiss of steam, and the shouts of engineers testing their creations. In the glow of furnaces, new ships took shape, half machine, half miracle. The smell of coal smoke became the scent of a new age. The seas, once ruled by the whisper of sails, now trembled under the pulse of engines. By the 1830s, the dream had spread to the open ocean. Builders were no longer content with riverboats and coastal ferries. They sought to conquer the Atlantic itself. The challenge was immense: to carry enough coal for the journey, to build engines strong enough to endure storms, to construct hulls capable of surviving the vast, merciless sea. Yet men like Brunel believed it could be done, and soon they would prove it. The early steamships were imperfect, slow, smoky, and prone to breakdowns. But they represented something far greater than their flaws. They were the embodiment of a new idea: that progress was not a gift of nature, but a product of will. With every revolution of their paddle wheels, they declared that humanity had entered a new covenant with the ocean, one no longer bound by the breath of the wind. The birth of the steamship was not merely a technological event. It was a moment of transformation in the human story. A crossing from dependence to mastery, from the rhythm of tides to the beat of the engine. It was, in every sense, the beginning of modernity afloat. To understand the revolution of the steamship, one must step inside its beating heart, the engine room, where heat, water, and metal work together in a symphony of invention. Beneath the decks, where the air was thick with coal smoke and the rhythmic thump of pistons echoed like a mechanical pulse, the true power of the new age was born. The first steamships were, at their core, floating furnaces. At the center of their power was the steam engine, an adaptation of James Watt's design that already transformed the industries of the Yacht, land. It was a simple principle, but one that carried profound consequences. When water was heated, it turned to steam, expanding with enormous force. This steam could be channeled into cylinders, pushing pistons that turned cranks and wheels. The movement that had once been driven by wind was now produced by pressure, invisible, constant, and controllable. In early vessels like Robert Fulton's Clermont, the engine was a single, upright cylinder that operated two massive side-paddled wheels, one on each flank of the ship. Each paddle wheel was fitted with large wooden blades that dipped rhythmically into the water, propelling the vessel forward. To onlookers, the motion seemed almost magical, as if the ship were walking across the river's surface. The paddles churned water into white foam, the chimney poured smoke into the sky, and the hiss of escaping steam sang like the voice of progress. But inside the hull, conditions were anything but romantic. The engineers or stokers worked tirelessly in brutal heat, shoveling coal into glowing furnaces. Each shovelful fed the fire that boiled the ship's water in heavy iron boilers, often riveted by hand. The pressure inside those boilers could reach dangerous levels. Early steamships were infamous for explosions, catastrophic bursts of heat and metal that could tear a vessel apart. Yet, even these dangers could not halt the march of progress. Each accident became a lesson, and every lesson an improvement. The machinery was massive and complex, yet every element served a purpose. The boiler was the ship's stomach, consuming coal to produce the steam that fed its muscles. The cylinder and piston were the muscles themselves, converting pressure into motion. The paddle wheels, or later the propellers, were the limbs that drove it forward. Together, they formed a living organism of iron and fire, a ship that was more than a vessel. It was an engine made to conquer the sea. As technology advanced, so did design. The earliest engines were low pressure, using gentle steam that minimized risk but limited power. By the 1820s and 1830s, engineers began to experiment with high-pressure systems, capable of greater efficiency and speed. This shift was crucial in the development of transoceanic travel, where endurance mattered as much as strength. One of the most important innovations was the marine condenser, introduced by pioneers like Watt and improved by later engineers. This device cooled and recycled steam back into water, reducing fuel consumption and extending a ship's range. It was a small, mechanical miracle, a closed loop that allowed a vessel to breathe in its own rhythm, making long voyages possible without constant resupply. The materials of construction evolved just as rapidly. At first, steamships were built from traditional oak and pine, the same woods that had carried sailing vessels for centuries. But steam power demanded stronger, more rigid structures. The engines were heavy, the vibrations constant, and the heat immense. Shipbuilders began to reinforce wooden frames with iron struts, then to experiment with entirely iron hulls. These early ironclads were not only stronger, but also less prone to rot and fire, two of the greatest dangers of the wooden age. The move from wood to iron marked a turning point. For the first time, shipbuilders were not limited by the size or strength of trees. Iron allowed ships to grow larger, more stable, and more efficient. It also paved the way for new forms of propulsion. While paddle wheels dominated the early decades, they were not without flaws. They were vulnerable in rough seas and inefficient in deep water. Then came the screw propeller, a seemingly simple device that would transform naval engineering forever. Invented and refined by men like John Ericsson and Francis Pettit Smith, The screw propeller replaced the side-mounted paddles with a spiral blade at the stern, driven by the same steam engine. It was more compact, more efficient, and far better suited to ocean travel. When Ericsson's propeller-driven USS Princeton launched in 1843, she demonstrated beyond doubt that the screw will be the future of maritime propulsion. The old image of a ship with churning wheels soon gave way to a sleeker silhouette, a true marriage of science and design. Inside the hull, the layout of these early steamers was as fascinating as their exteriors. The engine room, often amidships, was the vessel's mechanical heart. Nearby were the coal bunkers, vast compartments stacked with the black fuel that powered every voyage. On long crossings, these bunkers had to be constantly replenished. A ship might carry hundreds of tons of coal, yet every hour consumed tons of it. The smell of smoke and soot was inescapable, coating every surface, every lung, every rope with the residue of progress. Above the decks, however, passengers often saw none of this. Steamships were built for comfort as well as power. Even in the earliest days, designers sought to create spaces of refinement, wooden paneling, oil lamps, brass fittings, and dining rooms where travelers could forget for a moment that they were afloat atop an industrial furnace. As the decades passed, this balance of power and elegance would give rise to a new class of vessel, the ocean liner, a floating city of steam and steel. The technological evolution of the steamship was breathtaking in its pace. In just 50 years, the world moved from the tentative paddles of the Clermont to the massive engines of Brunel's SS Great Eastern, a leap as profound as that from the Wright brothers' flyer to the modern jet. The principles remained the same: fire, water, motion. But the scale had changed beyond imagination. Each improvement, each bold experiment brought humanity closer to a dream as old as the sea itself: mastery over the waves. No longer did a captain wait for a fair wind. He commanded power at will. No longer was a voyage at the mercy of nature. The engine room became the new altar of the sea, and its priests were the engineers who understood its mysteries. The early steamships were clumsy and imperfect, yes, but they were alive with promise. They marked the moment when mankind ceased to drift with the tides and began, for the first time, to define its own course. Beneath their decks, amid the clang of metal and the hiss of steam, the modern world was being forged. When the first steamships began their service, the world watched in fascination and disbelief. These new vessels, huffing and clanking like mechanical beasts, were unlike anything the oceans had ever seen. To the seasoned sailor, they seemed unnatural. Ships that moved without sails, that defied the wind, that breathed fire and smoke. Yet within a few short decades, they would come to dominate the waterways of the world, carrying with them not only cargo and passengers, but the very spirit of a new age. The early years of steam navigation belonged to the rivers and coastal waters. It was here, in calmer, more predictable environments, that the technology first found its footing. On America's great arteries, the Mississippi, the Ohio, and the Hudson, steamships became lifelines for a rapidly expanding nation. They connected frontier towns, transported cotton, grain, and goods, and carried travelers across distances that once took weeks to traverse by wagon or sail. By the 1820s, the Mississippi River had become a highway of progress. Paddle steamers like the Natchez and Robert E. Lee plied its muddy waters, their tall twin stacks trailing plumes of black smoke against the southern sky. To stand on a riverbank and watch one approach was to witness a spectacle, a sight both elegant and raw. The great paddle wheels churned up the current in broad white arcs, while brass whistles echoed across the plains. These riverboats became icons of the American frontier, their very names evoking adventure and enterprise. Inside, their saloons gleamed with polished wood and velvet curtains. Gambling tables and orchestras made them floating worlds unto themselves. Across the Atlantic, Europe too embraced the promise of steam. In Britain, the Comet, Clyde and Rob Roy linked ports along the Scottish and English coasts, shrinking the distances between cities that had once seemed remote. The River Clyde, in particular, became a crucible of innovation, a place where engineers refined engines, hulls, and propellers in a race to outdo one another. By the 1830s, steam ferries were a common sight in London, carrying passengers along the Thames with reliable punctuality, something impossible in the era of sail. But the greatest challenge remained: the open ocean. The idea that a steamship could cross the Atlantic was almost laughable at first. Critics insisted it was impossible. The ship would have to carry more coal than cargo. The boilers would fail in rough seas. The engines would drown in salt spray. Yet in 1819, a bold experiment silenced the skeptics. That year, the SS Savannah, a hybrid sailing ship fitted with a small auxiliary steam engine, set out from the United States bound for Liverpool. Her voyage was a cautious one. She used her engines for only a fraction of the journey, relying mostly on her sails. But the achievement was undeniable. For the first time, a steam-powered vessel had crossed the Atlantic. It was a modest success, yet it marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the ocean itself would become a highway, not a barrier. Over the following decades, engineers and shipbuilders refined the art of oceanic steam navigation. The Great Western, launched in 1838 by the visionary Isambard Kingdom Brunel, was a milestone. She was the first steamship built expressly for regular transatlantic service, 236 feet long with powerful side paddles and vast coal bunkers. Her maiden voyage from Bristol to New York took just 15 days, a speed unimaginable for sailing ships of her size. More importantly, she arrived with fuel to spare, proving that steam could indeed conquer the Atlantic. The world had changed forever. The Great Western Steamship Company, along with others like Cunard Line, soon established regular services across the Atlantic. Steamers began to carry mail, passengers, and precious goods between Europe and the Americas with unprecedented reliability. The Cunard Britannia, launched in 1840, made the crossing in under 2 weeks, and her success ushered in a new age of international connection. Business, diplomacy, and migration accelerated in ways no one had foreseen. Families divided by oceans could now be reunited in days instead of months. Commerce flourished. The world grew smaller. Life aboard these early ocean steamers was both thrilling and perilous. The decks vibrated constantly with the pulse of the engines, and the air was filled with the smell of hot oil and coal smoke. At night, the glow from the funnels illuminated the sky, a fiery beacon in the darkness. For passengers, the experience was transformative. They could dine in comfort while the ship powered relentlessly forward, indifferent to headwinds or calms. The sea, once a realm of fear and unpredictability, was becoming tame. A thing to be measured, scheduled, and charted. For the crews, however, life was far from easy. The stokers worked in hellish conditions, shoveling coal into roaring furnaces for hours on end, stripped to the waist and drenched in sweat. The engineers tended their machines like priests attending a sacred fire, constantly adjusting valves and watching gauges. A single mistake could lead to catastrophe. A burst boiler, a flooded engine room, a fire that could consume the ship within minutes. These men were the unsung heroes of the steam age, their toil hidden below decks, their endurance the price of progress. Steam also transformed naval warfare. The great sailing fleets of the 18th century, with their majestic lines of cannon and tall masts, were swiftly rendered obsolete. The first steam warships, like Britain's HMS Comet, 1822, and France's Sphinx, 1829, demonstrated that an engine could outmaneuver any sail-powered enemy. By the 1850s, with the advent of screw propulsion and iron armor, the world's navies entered a new era. The Crimean War and the American Civil War would both showcase the terrifying power of steam. Ships that could move and fight regardless of the wind, that could turn and ram with unstoppable force, that could change the balance of the seas forever. Yet for all their might, these early vessels carried an aura of grace. The sight of a steamship leaving harbor at dawn was something both mechanical and poetic. A plume of smoke rising into the pale sky, the slow beat of paddles echoing across the water, the faint hiss of valves as the engines came to life. To watch one depart was to glimpse the spirit of an age. Human ingenuity made visible, pressing forward toward horizons once thought unreachable. By the mid-19th century, steamships were everywhere, ferrying goods along coasts, carrying emigrants to the New World, linking continents through regular mail services, and patrolling distant colonies under naval ensigns. The seas had become highways of commerce and connection. Every port echoed with the sound of steam whistles. Every harbor skyline was darkened by the smudge of coal smoke. The age of the steamship was not just about technology, it was about transformation. Oceans no longer divided nations. They connected them. Time, once measured in months, was now counted in days. The rhythm of the world had quickened, and humanity, for the first time in its long history, had truly mastered the sea. Every new age is born not only from triumphs, but also from trials, moments of daring that test the limits of human ambition. The steamship era was no different. For every vessel that returned to port in glory, another vanished beneath the waves, claimed by the same forces it sought to master. Yet even in tragedy, these ships carved their names into history, their stories becoming legends whispered in harbors and retold across generations. The first of these great legends was Isambard Kingdom Brunel's SS Great Western. When she made her maiden voyage in 1838, she proved that steam could cross the Atlantic safely and efficiently. But Brunel was not content with one success. His next creation, the SS Great Britain, 1843, was a marvel of engineering. The first ocean-going ship built entirely of iron and driven by a screw propeller rather than paddle wheels. At over 320 feet long, she dwarfed every ship before her, combining power, elegance, and durability in a way that seemed almost futuristic. Her launch was an event of national pride. Thousands gathered on the River Avon to see her slide into the water, her iron hull gleaming in the sunlight. She represented everything Britain stood for: progress, empire, and industrial genius. Her maiden voyage to New York in 1845 took just 14 days, setting a new standard for transatlantic travel. Passengers spoke in awe of her comfort, her smooth motion, her mechanical precision. The Great Britain was not just a ship, she was a declaration that steam had conquered the oceans. But progress has its price. As engineers pushed for larger, faster, and more powerful ships, the dangers grew alongside ambition. Boilers exploded, fires broke out, and hulls split under the strain of storms. The SS President, one of the largest steamships of her time, set sail from New York in 1841 and was never seen again. Dozens of similar tragedies followed, each one a grim reminder that the sea was still a force to be respected. Yet the disasters did not stop humanity from pressing onward. Each loss led to stronger designs, safer boilers, and sturdier hulls. The dream of perfecting steam continued. Then came Brunel's most audacious creation, the SS Great Eastern. Launched in 1858, she was beyond anything the world had ever imagined. A floating colossus of iron, nearly 700 feet long, 5 times the size of any ship afloat. She was designed to carry 4,000 passengers around the world without refueling, powered by both paddle wheels and screw propellers. To build her, Brunel had to invent new methods of construction, new machinery, even new docks. The world watched in disbelief as the giant ship took shape, her vast frame rising above the Thames like a steel cathedral. But the Great Eastern was both a triumph and a tragedy. Her launch was plagued by technical difficulties and financial ruin. Investors lost fortunes. Brunel himself died shortly after her first voyage. Yet the ship would go on to achieve greatness in an unexpected way, not as a passenger liner, but as a pioneer of communication. In the 1860s, the Great Eastern was repurposed to lay the first successful transatlantic telegraph cable, linking Europe and America by wire. In that single act, she united continents not just by steam, but by signal, turning the world into a smaller, more connected place. The legacy of these giants inspired a new generation of steamships, faster, safer, more elegant. The Cunard Line and the White Star Line competed fiercely for dominance of the Atlantic routes. Their ships became symbols of prestige and national pride, each new vessel boasting greater speed and luxury than the last. The RMS Britannia, RMS Oceanic, and RMS Teutonic were floating palaces, carrying not only emigrants and merchants but also aristocrats, politicians, and artists across the sea. Steam had become more than a tool. It was a lifestyle, a mark of modern civilization. But the sea had not forgotten how to take. In 1873, the RMS Atlantic struck rocks off Nova Scotia and sank, claiming more than 500 lives. In 1904, the General Slocum caught fire in New York's East River, killing over 1,000 passengers, most of them women and children. Each disaster shocked the public, spurring calls for reform, better safety measures, and new maritime laws. Out of these tragedies grew international conventions on life-saving equipment, fireproof materials, and radio communication, all born from the hard lessons of the steam age. Not all defining moments were tragic. Some were feats of endurance and courage. The RMS Umbria and Etruria, launched in the 1880s, were among the last great paddle steamers and the fastest ships of their day, capable of crossing the Atlantic in under 7 days. Their record-breaking runs captured the imagination of millions and earned them the prestigious Blue Rebound, the unofficial prize for the fastest transatlantic voyage. Speed had become the new measure of greatness, a symbol of mankind's relentless drive to go farther, faster, always forward. The 19th century's final decades were a golden age of steam. Ships grew grander, routes more reliable, and passengers more diverse. Steamers connected continents, carrying mail from London to Bombay, wool from Sydney to Liverpool, and immigrants from Europe to America. In their dark holds lay the cargo of empire: tea, spices, textiles, and dreams. On their polished decks walked people from every nation, bound together by the rhythm of the engines beneath their feet. By the dawn of the 20th century, the ocean was no longer a wilderness. It was a network of iron and steam, charted, scheduled, and timed with precision. Steamships had become the lifeblood of globalization, the arteries through which flowed the commerce and culture of an industrial world. And yet, just as their power reached its peak, a shadow began to form. The beginning of a new age of even greater power and of greater tragedy. For on the horizon another vessel would rise, one that would embody the pride and hubris of humanity's achievements at sea. Her name would be Titanic. But before her came all those who had made her possible. The Savannah, the Great Western, the Great Britain, the Great Eastern, each a step on the long steaming road toward that fateful night in 1912. The steam age had begun with courage and ended with myth. It was an era of invention, destruction, and rebirth, a story written in iron, fire, and salt water. Every whistle that echoed across the waves carried within it a memory of those who dared to tame the sea, and sometimes paid the price for it. When the first steamships set out upon the rivers and oceans of the world, few could have imagined how deeply they would alter not only commerce and travel, but the very soul of human civilization. The impact of steam extended far beyond technology. It changed the way people saw distance, time, and even destiny. The age of steam reshaped the rhythm of life and left behind a legacy that still echoes in the hum of modern engines and the soft sigh of ships that ply the seas today. A world connected before steam. The world was vast. Oceans divided continents like barriers of eternity. A letter from London to Bombay could take half a year to arrive. Families separated by migration might never see each other again. Steam changed all of this. For the first time in history, people could count on time itself, on schedules, on punctuality, on a new and astonishing predictability. The steamship lines of the 19th century created what historians later called the first global network. Mail steamers carried letters across the Atlantic, through the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, and onward to India, China, and Australia. Cargo that once took months to move by sail could now be transported in weeks. The world's pulse quickened. Empires expanded their reach. The British Empire, in particular, found itself bound together by a web of steam routes stretching from Southampton to Calcutta, from Cape Town to Hong Kong, a network so vast that it was said the sun never set on the smoke of British steamers. These ships were the arteries of empire and the vessels of globalization. They carried soldiers and settlers, silk and coal, machinery and ideas. Steam turned migration into a mass movement. Millions of Europeans crossed the Atlantic in search of new lives in the Americas, carried by great liners whose decks became bridges between continents. For many, their first sight of the new world was framed by the iron rail of a steamship, and for some, it was the last view of their old homeland, fading into the mist. The steamship in culture and imagination. The steamship did not just transform the material world, it transformed the imagination. Writers, poets, and painters of the 19th century found in it a symbol of progress, courage and human mastery. To board a steamship was to embark on a voyage not only across water but across time, from the old world into the modern age. Charles Dickens, who sailed aboard the Britannia in 1842, described the experience with awe and unease. The smoke, the noise, the trembling decks. It was a living machine, a thing both magnificent and terrifying. Jules Verne made the steamship a symbol of adventure in Around the World in 80 Days, 1872, where speed and precision defined the modern hero. Joseph Conrad, himself a sailor, later turned the engine room into a metaphor for civilization's hidden heart, hot, mechanical, indispensable, and fragile. Artists painted the age of steam as both sublime and ominous. William Turner's famous painting The Fighting Téméraire, 1839, captured the end of the sailing era, a majestic wooden warship being towed by a small, smoke-belching tug. In that image, the world saw not only the triumph of progress, but also its melancholy, the passing of beauty, the surrender of romance to machinery. The steamship became both muse and mourner, its trails of smoke marking the horizon between past and future. Music, too, echoed the new rhythm of the age, the slow beat of engines, the distant call of steam whistles, the hiss of valves. These became the new soundtrack of civilization. Composers and poets described the iron heart of the sea with wonder and reverence. Even today, the sound of a ship's whistle drifting through fog stirs something deep within us. The memory of departure, of longing, of mankind's eternal conversation with the ocean. Symbols of power and progress. By the late 19th century, the steamship had become more than transportation. It was a status symbol, a projection of national pride and industrial might. Great nations competed to build the largest, fastest, most luxurious liners. Each new ship was hailed as a triumph of science and spirit, a monument to human ingenuity. Names like Mauretania, Lusitania, and Olympic became synonymous with progress itself. Harbors around the world became stages for these floating marvels. Crowds gathered to see them depart, waving flags and handkerchiefs, listening to brass bands as the ship's whistles answered in deep, resonant tones. The departure of a steamship was not merely a routine event, it was a ceremony of modernity. The sight of great liners steaming out to sea at sunset, their funnels trailing dark ribbons of smoke, filled observers with pride and perhaps a quiet awe at humanity's conquest of the elements. Steamships also played a crucial role in shaping science and exploration. They carried naturalists, explorers, and scientists to the most remote corners of the globe. The HMS Beagle, though still partly sail-driven, laid the groundwork for this tradition. Later, steam-powered vessels would continue it, mapping unknown coasts, studying currents, and bringing back samples from uncharted lands. Without steam, the scientific revolution of the 19th century, the exploration of the poles, the laying of undersea cables, the study of oceanography, would have been impossible. The twilight of steam. Yet even as the age of steam reached its zenith, the seeds of its decline had already been sown. The invention of the internal combustion engine and the rise of oil-powered ships in the early 20th century signaled a new transformation. Diesel engines were lighter, more efficient, and required no stokers or endless tons of coal. The romance of the furnace, the glow of fire in the belly of the ship began to fade. By the 1920s and 1930s, the great coal-fired liners were slowly replaced by sleek, oil-fueled vessels. Their funnels thinned, their smoke cleared. The age of steam had not ended suddenly, but quietly, like the dying of a long, proud heartbeat. The world had moved once more, onward, faster and farther. And yet, the legacy of the steamship endures. Many of those grand vessels have survived as museums, lovingly preserved reminders of an age when the world was first bound together by fire and water. The SS Great Britain now rests in Bristol, restored to her former glory. Visitors walk her decks and feel, in the hush of her iron hull, the echo of engines that once shook the oceans. In Glasgow, the PS Waverley, the last seagoing paddle steamer in the world, still sails, her paddles turning gracefully, her whistle cutting through the air like a voice from the past. Steamships live on too in our language. We still speak of steaming ahead, of full steam, of letting off steam. These phrases, born from the age of iron and smoke, have outlasted the ships themselves, becoming metaphors for energy, willpower, and drive, the very qualities that built the modern world. A legacy of transformation. The story of the steamship is the story of humanity learning to command nature, not to destroy it, but to navigate it with purpose. It was the age when mankind first realized that distance could be defeated, that oceans could be crossed not by faith in the wind, but by the certainty of fire. It was an age of hope, of discovery, and of consequence. For steam brought not only connection, but also conquest. It carried goods, knowledge, and people, but also empires, wars, and inequality. The very power that united the world also reshaped it, for better and for worse. And yet, in every hiss of steam and every turn of a paddle wheel, there was wonder. The steamship remains one of humanity's most poetic inventions, a bridge between the age of sail and the age of electricity, between the dream of exploration and the reality of global connection. It was a machine, yes, but also a symbol of courage, ambition, and the eternal desire to move forward, no matter the cost. When we look back upon the age of the first steamships, we are not merely observing the rise of a technology. We are witnessing the turning of a page in the story of humanity itself. It was a moment when the age of wind yielded to the age of will, when mankind learned not only to harness nature, but to replicate its forces. From the quiet hiss of the first experimental boilers to the thunderous beat of the great ocean liners, the era of steam marked the awakening of modern civilization's pulse. For thousands of years, the sea had been a vast uncertainty, a wilderness that could be crossed only through patience, faith, and fortune. Sailors had waited for winds and prayed through storms, guided by stars and superstition. The ocean was alive, but it was sovereign. The advent of steam changed this forever. For the first time, ships could move regardless of breeze or calm, night or day. The sea had met its equal, not in defiance, but in partnership. The first steamships were small, trembling creations, half machine, half dream. Their builders did not yet fully understand what they had made. Each voyage was an act of courage, each success a revelation. But as they improved, as iron replaced wood and propellers replaced paddles, something extraordinary occurred. Humanity's sense of time itself changed. Journeys once measured in months became matters of days. Letters that once crossed oceans in seasons could now do so in weeks. Empires expanded, trade flourished, and people began to imagine the world as a single, connected whole. It was not just distance that was conquered, but isolation. Steamships carried migrants seeking new homes, lovers reuniting after long separations, explorers setting out toward uncharted lands. They carried the dreams of nations and the hopes of individuals. They were more than transport. They were the vessels of destiny. Every plume of smoke rising against the horizon was a declaration that humanity had mastered the art of motion, that no frontier, no ocean could hold it still. Yet, for all their might, these ships also reminded us of our fragility. The same fire that drove them could destroy them. The same sea that bore them could claim them without mercy. Steamships stood at the delicate boundary between progress and peril, between mastery and humility. Their story is not one of conquest alone, but of balance, of the eternal dialogue between humankind and the elements that shape its fate. As the decades passed and technology advanced, the heartbeat of steam began to fade. The world moved on to diesel and electricity, to turbines and jets. The furnaces cooled, the stokers disappeared, and the last of the great coal-fired ships went silent. But their spirit did not vanish. It lingers still, in every engine that hums, in every vessel that traces the curve of the horizon, in every human heart that feels the call of faraway places. Today, when one stands at a harbor at dusk and watches a ship depart, the scene is not so different from those early days. The same glimmer of light, the same sense of departure, the same quiet wonder at the meeting of man and sea. The difference lies not in the view, but in the understanding. For now we know what that first wisp of steam began. It was the moment humanity found a new rhythm, one powered by its own hands. Steamships gave us more than transportation. They gave us confidence in invention, in progress, in the idea that we could shape our own future. They taught us that the world, vast and wild, could also be known, traversed, and shared. And they left behind not only relics of metal and rivets, but a legacy of imagination. Even now, stories of their voyages fill museums and books, their silhouettes still inspire painters, and their names still echo. Clermont, Great Britain; Savannah, Great Eastern. Each is a chapter in the long chronicle of our ascent. And perhaps in the stillness of the night, when the sea is calm and the wind is soft, one might almost hear it again. The distant throb of pistons, the slow churn of paddles, the whisper of steam escaping into the cool air. A heartbeat, faint but steady, rising from the depths of time. For though the age of steam has passed, its soul endures. In every voyage begun, in every horizon pursued, in every spark of human curiosity that refuses to rest. The sea remains vast, but it is no longer unknowable, and somewhere in its endless expanse, the ghosts of those first steamships still glide through the mist, proud, patient, eternal, carrying with them the memory of the moment when humankind first set its own fire upon the waters.